Good morning and welcome to our Sycamore Township workshop meeting for Tuesday, April 14th, 2020. The time is 9:02. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we are following House Bill 197. This allows local government the opportunity to conduct business meetings remotely and at the same time comply with the stay-at-home and social distancing recommendations. Now, as I mentioned the last meeting, due to the electronic format of the meeting, there will be no in-person comments. However, members of the public may submit concerns, any questions prior to the meeting to Ray Warwick, our administrator. You'll find a link to those live streams, trustee meetings on our website. Tape videos of our meetings are also available on the website. And we hope that you're staying safe and healthy, because together we're going to get through this. Fiscal Officer Rob Porter, would you call the roll?
Mr. LaBarbera?
Here.
Mr. James?
Here.
Mr. Weedman?
Mr. Weedman?
You're muted, I think. Or your audio is very low.
How about that?
There we go. Perfect.
Oh, that's good. That sounds good. Now I have to ask Mr. James, Mr. Weedman, Mr. Porter, Law Director Deepak Desai, do you give your authorization for your name to be signed electronically? And I'll also give my okay. Gentlemen?
I do.
I do.
I do.
Okay. I'll make a motion to approve the April 2nd meeting minutes. Do we have a second?
Second.
Any discussion?
Mr. LaBarbera?
Yes, yay.
Mr. James?
Aye.
Mr. Weedman?
Fiscal Officer, Mr. Porter, do you have the bills?
I didn't hear a response from Tom. Did Tom respond? Tom? Weedman?
There it is.
Okay. Got it. I got
There
it.
you go.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Rob Porter, Fiscal Officer, do you have the bills and receipts?
Yes, we had receipts of $10,328,305.76, disbursements of $289,530.74. A complete listing of all receipts and disbursements should be available in your packet. Thank you.
Motion to approve?
Second. Just a quick question, Mr. Porter, does that include the first 6 months of tax payments from the auditor for this year? Is that with the big dollar?
That 10 million is, most of that is from the, you'll see it on the list there. It's from Dusty Roads payment of the tax, real estate tax. Now, not all 10 million is going to end up in our funds. We pay approximately half of that to the school districts on the TIF payments. So, but we haven't made that distribution yet. So that's why it's the full 10 million in there now.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. LaBarbera?
Aye.
Mr. James?
Aye.
Mr. Weedman?
Aye.
Sheriff's Report, Lieutenant Smith had an emergency, will not be here. Apparently a house emergency with flooding in the basement, 6 inches of water. But I did want to publicly thank him and our Hamilton County Sheriff's officers, recently escorted by our Sycamore Township Fire Department. They donated 50 pizzas to Jewish hospitals, healthcare workers on the front lines of the COVID-19 pandemic. I stopped by the firehouse to thank the gentleman on behalf of our trustees. And I know our Administrator Ray Warwick stopped by also. And again, thank you, Lieutenant Smith and Sheriff Jim Neal. All right, Sycamore Township Fire Chief Penny with the Fire EMS Report. You're on the front line. How's the team doing?
Good. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, we
Yes,
can. I
okay.
want to mention too, the Safety Services team with you guys working with the Sheriff's Department that day, giving out the pizzas. The residents should know that the Sycamore Township Fire Department, in cooperation with the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office, you're offering the happy birthday drive-bys. Is that right, for the youngsters? And
Yeah,
with Assistant Chief Cooper on that? That's
yeah.
right.
Jerry's been heading that up. He's been doing a really good job at that. We've had quite a response.
Chief, what do you have for us?
Just kind of give you an update on some of the COVID stuff. We've had 16 runs so far where we've had the criteria based that the patients have fit the criteria for the COVID. We did have one confirmed case, and looks like right now we've got about 8 cases that are in the township that are being quarantined in their house. So we have that information. If we get a run to their area or their house, we'll know about it ahead of time. Our guys have been doing a great job at following the PPE protocol and the SOPs that we have in place. Everybody's been very safe, and we've not had any problems with our guys coming down with any symptoms or anything like that. So far we've been doing very well. And thanks to Trustee Wiedemann, he was able to point us toward the direction of some gowns through the EMA, I believe it was. And we were able to pick up 100 gowns from them. So we got some gowns. We've got some EMS supplies have started coming in. We've got the thermometer covers and some masks. So we're in pretty good shape right now as far as the supplies, and we got more stuff still coming in. So right now we're doing pretty good with this part of it. As you guys all know, we had quite a little storm come through the other night, and we had some significant damage with some houses in the township. And I believe I sent you guys the pictures of those. And the guys went out the next day and tarped some roofs and tried to do a little public service to help the residents out. And so hopefully those will be over with, and these people that had some damage to their house will get back on their feet. If anybody needs any help from us, we'd be more than happy to help them as best we can. So, and as you said, the birthday party's been going well. The only thing else I have to report is that so far this with this COVID thing, our cost is just a little over $22,000 that we're going to be able to put in as a reimbursement for the expenses that we've done on EMS supplies and all the equipment. The guys went out the other day and bought some of those Wagner airless sprayers, those paint sprayers, and those things work great to mix with alcohol and water and spray down the inside of the squads and disinfect everything. So we purchased those, not that expensive, but they work like a charm. So we're doing everything we can to keep ourselves safe and to keep everything disinfected and be ready for the next run.
Chief?
So that's all.
Thanks a lot. Any questions?
Yeah, Chief, how is your supply of alcohol?
We're not too bad because we've got some stuff that came in through our EMS supplies, and also all these flu kits we have all have some alcohol stuff in it too. So, and I got you guys to look right here. I've got 8 cases sitting in my office. So
Great.
I think unless we get another big outbreak that could cause a problem, I think we're going to be okay.
Okay, good.
Comments, Tom James?
Chief, if there's anything you need, don't hesitate to let us know. I know you will. Thanks for keeping us informed on what went on Chetburt and the surrounding area with the damage there the other day. Is there anything more needed over there that you know of, or that Tracy and his crew might need to get on as to cleaning up brush there from that?
I know Tracy and the crew went over there the day after the storm and did a lot of tree removal and some trying to get the roads cleaned up and that sort of thing. So we were kind of coordinate things with them. So that was doing fine. I don't think of anything. I'll turn it over to Jerry and see if he has anything that can add to it. But as far as I know, I think we're okay.
Yeah, I was down there the day after. It was real hard to try to evaluate everything that night. Just a rough number going through my pictures and the walkthrough that you guys had seen. Those Chief forwarded to you, but we had about 11 homes that were damaged, and probably 9 of those were significant with the large trees down and stuff. So we were lucky that night. We didn't have any injuries, but some of the damage was extensive. And I want to take this time to remind everybody not to take the severe weather season lightly. If I'm able to share my screen here, if our residents go to our website, if they scroll down here a little bit on the homepage, there's a link here that you can go through Hamilton County Alert, and then also the Smart 911. You can sign up for weather alerts and any other emergencies that might come through Hamilton County. So all you got to do is just click right here, and that will take you to the link and the page for you to sign up for that. It works pretty good. I have it signed up for myself here at the address at the fire station. And as soon as those warnings came through, my phone was going off for every warning with the address that I had entered. So if anybody wants to take the time, I highly suggest you sign up for that stuff. And then the Smart 911 obviously has all that information for you, the dispatcher can have in case of a medical emergency or something else. But yeah, we had some significant damage over there. I drove through again yesterday. It seems like they got all the large trees down so far, at least off of the homes. So I think they're doing pretty good down there right now. Touching on the parade thing, forget who brought it up, but we've done 20 of the drive-by hellos for birthdays so far. So the kiddos are really liking that. And we're going to continue that, and we do want to let everybody know to practice your social distancing, and we don't want large groups together. But we're more than happy to come out and take care of the kiddos out there that are having birthdays. So it makes my day to go out with them. So I enjoy it just as much.
Thanks, Coop. Did you, Tracy Cullums recently had a birthday. Did you do a drive-by for Tracy?
I tried to. I guess it was a short one. I think you saw me out there.
Road maintenance and recreation report, road supervisor Tracy Cullums.
Yes, I wanted to bring to you our 2020 Cape Seal project this year. Something we're looking. This is a process that we've been doing for a while. It has extended the life of our streets from about 12 years to approximately 20 years. All these streets that I'm looking to do this year are 12 and 13 years old. There's 14 roads. This is on a state bid. So the approximate cost of this is $165,000. So I just wanted to talk to you about it and possibly get a motion to proceed with this. I'm not looking to do a contract or anything yet. I just wanted to make sure you wanted to go ahead with this before I talked any further about it.
Tracy, do you have, this is in your budget, I think, isn't it?
This is in our budget. Well, so the only thing we've done so far is the curb, which came in just under 500,000. So altogether, this would put us at 654, which is 100,000 under budget.
Okay. I'll make a motion that we go out for, we're going out for bid in this case?
No, this is a state contract, state bid.
So we just need a motion to approve. I'll make a motion to approve the Cape Seal program.
I'll second that. Tracy, did you have more to add to that?
I did not, just whatever questions you had.
Okay, I do have some, but Tom, did you have any first?
I don't this time.
Okay. I know this is a regular thing we do. We're in an uncertain time financially going forward in the world. We're looking at reduced JEDS collections in an amount we aren't going to know for a little while, I think, depending on how long things are locked down. We just got our property tax infusion for the first part of the year from the county auditor, and hopefully we'll get all we're expecting later in the year. But depending on where the economy goes, property tax collections could be down. That's complete speculation. I don't have knowledge that they will be or won't be, but people are having some financial difficulties. So we could look at some reduced revenues going forward there too. I just want to voice those concerns. I'm happy to hear you said you're still 100,000 under the projected budget for the year. Are you thinking we're going to spend that extra 100 as we move later in the year with other projects that are in the pipeline?
No, this was all I was going to do this year because of the situation. I wasn't going to do it any other projects.
Okay. Is this something that I hate to defer maintenance that needs to be done, but is it something that needs to be done now as opposed to next year?
Well, it really needs to be done because of the condition of the streets. I mean, unfortunately, anytime we defer maintenance, the costs just they get much higher because sometimes the condition of the roads gets much worse, and you wouldn't be able to do a project like this. You'd have to go into more of a replacement project. So I think it's very important that we do it on these roads this year while still staying under budget.
A few other questions, but related comment. Also, I had some residents contact me from the neighborhood behind All Saints off of Glenover. I think they've been in touch with you or Mr. Warwick possibly also about some problems with what I think was the Cape seal or some other sealant put on their roadway in the last few years that's decaying rapidly. Have you been in touch with them about that?
I have talked to a few, and I've gone over and looked at it, and I did not see a problem. When it goes on, it's rough, and the traffic will smooth it out. I mean, the one problem, people think it's new pavement. It's not new pavement. It's a micro pavement that goes on top of existing pavement. So when I went over and looked at it, it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. I thought it looked good.
Did you speak to any of the residents back there about it?
Well, I only spoke to one gentleman. I didn't get any other phone calls. Earlier in the year or last year when they did it, I spoke to quite a few of them, but not recently.
Okay. There was someone who had identified some concerns on Facebook, I think, and I had suggested that someone have him contact you. I don't know if it's the same person, but you may hear from someone else there. Hopefully the problem's alleviated. And I didn't mean to get off topic here, but I didn't want to let that pass either. My other questions, though, were for Mr. Porter and Mr. Warwick. Just financially, are we good with proceeding with this right now?
I believe we are. Yeah.
Okay.
Mr. Warwick, are we?
Yeah, I mean, as we mentioned, I think last meeting on this kind of subject, I think we're in good shape. And Tracy makes an excellent point. When you push off road maintenance, the cost just goes up and up and up.
Okay. We made a motion. You in a second?
Yes.
Rob, you going to call a roll?
Sure. Mr. LaBarbera?
Aye.
Mr. James?
Aye.
Mr. Weedman?
Tracy, anything else?
No, that's all I had, unless you have any questions.
Yeah, I have some comments. We were talking before, Assistant Chief Cooper mentioned, besides the Dillonville area, a number of other residents took a hit. We've got a chipping machine, pick up branches at Dillonville. A few streets were hit hard. One house, Kugler Mill and Weatherfield, there's a stack of branches out there. If you go on Miami Hills Drive, there are a number of houses have tree limbs at the curb. Any chance, I know yesterday we're expecting 50-mile-an-hour winds, but any chance that we'll consider doing the pickup for some of those other streets?
Well, that would be up to you. With the social distancing and the cancellation of our brush pickups and everything, we've been going out and clearing right-of-ways, clearing streets, but all of our services where we're going to people's houses have been postponed until further notice. We've talked to quite a few people out there, told them different things that they could do. I mean, we have not been going to people's houses. If that's something that you want the maintenance department to do, that's certainly.
Well, you just mentioned it over in Dillonville, in that area over there. If you could just have somebody just drive by Miami Hills Drive, there's a number of houses there. Just take a look at it and see if you could help them.
Okay.
Another question I had, Brian Sheehan. I believe I talked to Steve about this resident on Bayberry and Heitmeyer contacted me the day after the storm. His power went out the next day, after the storm, for several hours. And he said neither the neighbors behind or in front of us, he said, ever loses power. He lives on Bayberry. If you turn in off of Kenwood Road, his house is on the right side of the street. Those houses seem to have an outage every few weeks. And then maybe you can check, is there a problem with the grid? I told him I would mention it in the workshop, and I might add our power in Sturbridge goes out frequently. And I believe, talking to Steve, your assistant, he said that our former administrator was working on this. Could you look into that?
Yes. Yeah, I know our former administrator was working with Duke's former representative, government representative, who's also gone now. So we have a new person to deal with new government representative. So I'll give him a call and see what's going on. I mean, obviously we've had troubles back in there for quite some time. I know Duke's been over there. They've done work. I know they were talking to the residents and trying to work something out. I do not know where that stands right now, but I can certainly call our representative and find out.
Hey, Trace, I've got one more thing.
Can I add something to the power thing, or is that what you were adding to, Jim?
No, go ahead, add to that.
Okay. Tracy, another concern related to that is a resident who serves on one of our township boards, actually, who lives on Kugler Mill, spoke with the Duke people who were working on Kugler Mill Road on the pole construction related to all the work going on there. The day the power went out last week, which was the day after the storm, and was told it was actually a planned outage as part of their construction. They took out the power in my neighborhood, in Heitmeyer Farms, in Sturbridge, and all the way down to Seasons Retirement Community, leaving all the elderly people in the dark for hours as well. And this was apparently not, at least based on this anecdotal report, was not due to storm damage. It was planned construction work. And if they're planning to take the power out at times and affecting such a big region, can we require them to give notice in advance, especially with all these people working at home and schooling from home right now? That was a major inconvenience for a lot of people that day. And if it's an act of God from weather or whatever, that's one thing. But if they're just going to take it down, they really need to notify people.
Yes, I mean, I really can't speak to that. I don't know who he talked to on the job. I mean, anytime they have a planned outage, people are always notified. I've never known them not to notify people on a planned outage. So what was the date of that? Do you know? Was it the day after the storm?
Yeah.
I believe it was last Friday.
Yeah, it was the day after the storm.
Yeah.
I'll talk to our Duke representative about that at the same time, but I mean, I can't believe that they would do that without notification.
Right. It may be incorrect information from somebody on the line who thought that and didn't realize it, or it may have been an emergency due to the storm where they had to take something down to fix it. So I recognize that. But if they do have planned ones going forward, they should find a way to get that word out at least and try to avoid disrupting people's lives.
Yeah, that's what they do.
Yeah, they've done that, Trace, in the past. I think they've always notified us, haven't they? That seems to be.
Yes. Yeah, they always notify us and all the people that are affected also.
Good.
I have one more item, Trace. This bothers me. One of your men told me this.
There you go.
An update on the story. Apparently, a senior citizen on Sycamore Road, was approached by, and he thought one of your men. He said, "We've got some extra asphalt. I can asphalt your driveway." He said, "It'll cost you $200. So the senior citizen gives him $200. He finishes the job, comes back, knocks on the door, and says, "You know what? I used for asphalt. I need $1,000. So the guy gave him $1,000, $1,200. He stopped one of your guys, one of the maintenance guys, and said, "Hey, this isn't working right. What's wrong with this asphalt?" And the guy said, "What asphalt? That's not." Apparently, they stole asphalt from the township, and they're going around. They got this $1,200, and it's kind of a sad story. And I guess that they approached another person and got another person also.
Yes. So it was not our guys. It
Absolutely,
was
it wasn't. Yeah.
It was
absolutely.
people posing as members of Barrett's crew who was doing the Sycamore Road project. They said they were working for Barrett, not for the township. So Barrett's working for us. So they stole the coal patch from Barrett's lot. And I believe the number that this guy ended up paying him was $600. And he got the neighbor for about 50 or so. I have talked to Corporal Kidd about that. He went over there to talk to the gentleman. I have not followed up with Mr. Kidd, so I don't know what has come of that. But that is what happened. Somebody, couple guys in a pickup truck.
That's a shame. That's a shame. Thanks, Trace.
Yes.
Next up, our law director, Mr.
Hey,
Deepak.
Jim, sorry. A few other questions, if I could. Different topic. Tracy, sorry, got to find you in the grid on the screen here. You moved suddenly somehow. Just something to bring to your attention going forward into the spring here as your guys are out doing work. Up in the northern part of the township on, looking at my map, on Millview Drive and Glen Mill Court near Marlette, right off of Snyder. Last fall, when I was walking those neighborhoods, several residents pointed out township trees in the right-of-way that were poorly maintained, according to them. There were a few dead ones, and there were some that had been pulled out, or actually cut down, I guess, leaving stumps there in what they consider their yard, even though it may be our right-of-way. Can you have your guys at some point when they're up there take a look just along the right-of-way in those neighborhoods and see if anything needs tidying up that we've left behind on our property there? That would be helpful and make them happy, I think.
Sure. I know we did get a lot of stumps ground out, so those could have been on that list. I'll check that. As far as maintenance of trees in the right of way, anytime there's a problem, all the residents have to do is call us. Obviously, we don't go around looking at every right of way tree in the township. So if something needs maintenance, all they have to do is call us.
Great, thank you.
And Trace, I think those trees are pretty susceptible because they're all Bradford pears along that street, and those things don't last forever, unfortunately.
No, they don't. Those are ones that were planted after the tornado.
Okay, any other comments? Any questions for Tracy anymore? All right, law director, Deepak Desai.
Thank you, Mr. LaBarbera. Nothing to report.
Okay.
Question, sorry, also just to alert you, Mr. Desai. Yesterday, Deer Park City Council met and they had an online meeting on Facebook Live. They had a public hearing first at 6:30 to consider the JEDD agreement with Sycamore Township. Apparently they had approved it in the past and hadn't had a public hearing as the law required. I watched the meeting. They had some technical difficulties at first. It was their first online meeting. I know we had trouble with audio with ours as well, but you couldn't hear much of their meeting. So they adjourned, came back, waited for public comments, didn't get any, and then moved on to their regular meeting. And I tried to listen and watch the regular meeting. The audio was terrible in parts of it, but I'm not certain they then went back and approved the JEDD again after the public hearing. I don't know if that's strictly required, but I would think the approval has to follow a hearing, not precede it, even if they already did it. That's a question you could answer. But if you could check with Deer Park and make sure that one of the things they passed was actually approval again, if that's necessary. We want to get this done and don't want them to have to do it again. But if that approval is necessary, please check on it.
Sure. Ray, you want to reach out to BJ or you want me to do that?
I'll call BJ. I'll make sure they passed it. They had done it prior, and then we explained to BJ kind of have to do the hearing, so that's what that was. So I'll check in with him today.
Yeah, and if he could pass along, if they did do a resolution, if he could pass along that, or at least the numbers, so I could put it in the contract.
Sure.
Thank you.
Deepak, anything else?
Yes, sir.
All right, our administrator in Sycamore Township is Mr. Ray Ward. Ray, what do you have?
I've got 3 items. First one is draft social media policy for the handbook. And Rob Ebel, if you'll put that document up, please. And you also have this in your packet. And this, this language has gone through scrutiny by Mr. Desai and Mr. James, and I don't know who else, but this is the language that is on the table for consideration today.
Ray, are you looking for a motion to approve the inclusion of this into the employee manual?
Yes.
I so move.
I will second that.
Second.
I'll add some input as to this. At the Ohio Township Association convention this year, they made a push in, I think, a few of the seminars that I attended, on one in particular, that it's very important that townships have policies such as these, because there is conflicting case law in the state of Ohio now, which renders public employees Facebook posts and other social media posts that they thought were private, renders them to be public records, and gives the township or whatever government authority they work for an obligation to have to retain those records at that point. And one of the ways to avoid that is to make sure there are clear disclaimers made if there's any possibility of confusion that someone is speaking officially as opposed to personally. And this policy remedies that, at least in part. So I think it's an important thing for us to do. We want to make sure people know that when our employees are talking, they're speaking for themselves, not for the township as a whole when that occurs.
Any discussion? Vote. Mr. Porter?
Mr. LaBarbera,
Aye.
Mr. James,
Aye.
Mr. Weedman,
I couldn't hear that.
Aye.
Mr. Weedman,
Aye.
Thank you.
Next item is another, some more language for the employee handbook. It's political activities. It's in your packet. Once again, this went through a lot of scrutiny, and it's on the table for consideration today. I don't know.
I have a couple of questions and some comments. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead, Tom.
Ray, 2 months ago, you stated in our February workshop that, quote, many townships in the state have policies prohibiting employees from working on campaigns, end quote. Many seemed like a lot of townships to me. So I asked if you knew what percentage of the townships have those policies in effect, and you did not. Since that time, have you identified what percentage of the 1,308 townships in the state actually have policies that prohibit political participation in violation of their employees' First Amendment rights?
I have not.
Okay. So, Ray, you mentioned also that Sims Township has a policy in their handbook that prohibits any participation in the political process. I know that you and at least one of our other fellow trustees used that as a model and supported developing a policy for Sycamore Township. I read that policy and it was extreme in my opinion. Right after our meeting in February, I had a conversation with two of the three trustees in Sims Township, and they informed me that this policy was written in 2001, well before any of the existing trustees were even elected. As of last Thursday, two of the trustees told me that they're going to remove all of that language from their personnel policy manual because they don't want to abridge the rights of their employees, and they're seriously concerned what litigation exposure they would have by enforcing that policy. I know that policy was, at least originally, part of the foundation of your push along with Mr. LaBarbera to adopt the policy. Now that the policy is going to be eliminated in Sims, can you tell me what other townships policy you're looking at to help develop a framework for new language, or maybe just generally speaking, just restrictive policies that you favor?
Since that last meeting when that was discussed, I haven't looked at any other policies. So I wasn't in on the drafting of this.
Yeah, and if I could just interject, I apologize to interrupt you there, Ray, but the policy that is before the board today is a policy that is nowhere near what Sims Township policy was.
I get it.
The policy that is before the board today is a policy that I extracted out of a case from the Southern District of Ohio, the Western Division at Dayton, a decision by Judge Rice. So I just want to make that clear. What we're looking at today is not in any way, shape, or form based on the Sims Township policy. Sorry to interrupt, Ray and Mr. Weedman.
Okay. Let me just add to that too. Sorry, Mr. Desai and I have had a little back and forth communication about that too. And I agree, the Sims policy was a bit extreme, and it seemed to be modeled on one from Liberty Township in Delaware County, which was very similar also. So this policy moved in a very different direction from that. So continue, please.
I have some questions for Deepak as well. Deepak, as our law director, I'd like to ask you a few questions regarding this subject. You've researched this subject extensively, I presume, correct?
My law clerk has, and I have read through the cases that she has brought to me, but our firm as a team has researched it extensively.
And you just told us that you did write paragraph 2 of the proposed language that Mr. Ward presented to us today?
I did.
And I did notice that I did read City of Dayton versus Reynolds. And in that case, I believe, and you can help me with this, but I believe those were civil servants. And don't they live by a different rule that maybe other employees have to live by?
Well, the case was in federal court regarding their constitutional rights under the First Amendment. So the Ohio Revised Code statutes on civil servants were not at play.
Okay. I read both the George Bode versus Kenner City case, as well as the Ruff versus Leavenworth case, both cases that you provided to us to review. And I'm sure that both of my fellow trustees read those in detail as I did. As you know, the employees prevailed in both of those cases. And of course, the city had to pay the legal fees for the plaintiffs, which was a substantial amount of money. From everything that I read in those two cases, the one thing that stuck out to me was how much more restrictive our proposed language is versus the language in those two cases. So I'm wondering if those two cases could not survive constitutional scrutiny with language less restrictive than the new proposed language for Sycamore Township, how could we possibly support this language in our township policy? And you don't have to answer that, it's strictly a rhetorical question. But let me ask this. In your research, you probably looked at a lot of cases, correct?
Yes, we looked at a number of cases.
Okay. I think I probably know the answer to this question because I too did a little research. But what percentage of the cases did the written policy of local governments not pass constitutional scrutiny and left the government entity, and in turn, the residents of that government entity, holding the bag with significant financial liability?
So let me answer that question in a little bit broader format. And I part of this is I just want the residents who have taken the time out of their schedules to view this live to understand what we're talking about and understand what the township is trying to achieve and what I drafted. So we're talking about First Amendment right to free speech. As I believe most of us are aware, that is a right protected under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. It is a right that prohibits governmental intrusion and is always very, very scrutinized whenever the government tries to restrict free speech. In this particular situation, what we're dealing with is political speech, right? As an American, you can say, I love the Trump administration. As an American, I hate the Trump administration. As an American, I love the Obama administration. As an American, I hated the Obama administration. That is one of our rights as Americans, is to comment on government and to not risk being penalized for it. So you take that right that the Constitution provides, and you then deal with a situation where a government wants to limit an employee's right to speak about political activity. Most of us, I think, would have a initial reaction of, well, you can't restrict that if you're a public employer because you're government and I have a First Amendment right. Honestly, that was a lot of my thought when I entered this research several months ago. As I discussed at one of our meetings, what I found, surprisingly, was that the federal courts have said public employers have a compelling governmental interest in making the work environment politically neutral, apolitical, if you will. And so governments, public employers, are allowed to restrict the political activities of their public employees for the compelling interest of keeping the work environment politically neutral. The problem that most public employers have had is that the government cannot enact a law that is overly broad or that is ambiguous. The policy must be narrowly tailored to the compelling governmental interest. So I think an example helps. The government has a compelling compelling interest to prevent people from yelling fire in a movie theater. And the reason is you're going to incite panic, you're going to cause people to rush to the door, and people can be injured. On top of that, the business suffers a loss of revenue. So there's a compelling governmental interest for the government to be able to say, we can restrict free speech and tell you you cannot yell fire in a movie theater. What the government could not do is say, you can't use the word fire at all, because that is overly broad and is not narrowly tailored to the compelling governmental interest of preventing panic and injury in a movie theater. The other piece of that is that it can't be ambiguous. So if you have a law that says you cannot yell fire in a movie theater, that law may be found to be ambiguous. Does that mean that when you see a huge fire scene in Die Hard 3, that you can't yell, oh my God, look at that fire? So the law, in addition to being narrowly tailored, can't be ambiguous. So you would have to say you cannot yell fire in a movie theater unless you're reacting to a scene in the movie. So within that framework, and I hope that example helps, what we have found in the cases is that most governmental entities don't fail the constitutional scrutiny of the courts because they lack a compelling interest. They fail because they do not narrowly tailor their policy to the compelling interest of making the work environment politically neutral, and they do not, and they make their policy ambiguous. That's where most public employers fail, because they will say something like, you are prohibited from engaging in political campaign. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean I can't put a bumper sticker on my car? Does that mean I can't wear a t-shirt? Does that mean I can't tell my neighbor when we're talking over the fence that, hey, I think candidate A is great, I don't think candidate B is so good? That's ambiguous, and it's also not narrowly tailored. That is where most of the problem comes for public employers in these cases. It's not that they don't have a compelling governmental interest. It is that they do not narrowly tailor their policy and they do not make it clear. So what I did is I asked my law clerk to go and look at policies that were held to be constitutional. And lo and behold, as you mentioned in that city of Dayton case, she came back with a policy that I think takes care of making the work environment politically neutral, but also is narrowly tailored and is not ambiguous. And I just would like to mention a couple of things about that. First and foremost, as any attorney in this area will tell you, it is a slippery slope. And to your question, Mr. Weedman, yes, the vast majority of cases you find that these policies are struck down. Again, not because there is not a compelling governmental interest, but because the public employer failed to narrowly tailor their policy, and their policy is ambiguous.
In the eyes of a specific judge as well, correct?
Right. And that's the other thing. The other slippery slope aspect is we have hundreds of district courts throughout the United States. It's essentially the court of common pleas at the federal level. And as a result, one judge may view something to be constitutional and one judge may not.
Correct.
And you are always going to be subject to those, if you will, human characteristics. But the case that I relied on is the city of Dayton versus Reynolds. And here in Cincinnati, we are in what's called the United States District Court for the Southern District of Ohio, the Western Division. This case is from the United States District Court, Southern District of Ohio, Western Division. The only difference is there's one in Dayton and there's one in Cincinnati. And this is from Dayton. But it was authored by Judge Rice, who's a very well-respected judge. And in this case, what the court basically said was that you have the ability to narrowly tailor a policy that's going to be both constitutional and is going to be, it's going to be constitutional because it's narrowly tailored and it's not ambiguous. In this case, here was the policy. No employee shall take any part in political campaigning further than to express privately their opinions. Political campaigning includes any overt public expression or activity for or against a political organization or candidate, such as a formal public endorsement, acting as a poll worker, circulating nominating petitions, distributing campaign material of any kind, or posting campaign material other than on one's own person or personal private property. If you look at the policy that is before the board, you can see that I basically plagiarized that. And the reason I did that is, while it's a slippery slope, and I can't guarantee the township won't get sued for this policy and that it won't be held to be unconstitutional, I can tell you, when you look at a case from the United States District Court, the Southern District of Ohio, Western Division, and we basically use that exact policy, it's as close as I can come to saying this is good to go. Is it 100% safe? No, it is a slippery slope because another judge might view this differently. And you have to remember, a lot of cases turn on the facts and how it is applied in that case. One thing to note that's different about this policy, and a thank you to Trustee James. I did share the first draft of this policy with him, and he pointed out to me that there was a revised code provision that specifically prohibited any type of restriction on circulating nominating petitions. So if you look at the policy that's before the board, you'll see that piece of it has been taken out. Also, as I looked at the statute that Trustee James mentioned to me, I saw a couple other statutes that I thought the policy that was approved in the Reynolds case may run afoul of, and that was acting as a poll worker. So we took that piece out. And just to make sure everybody understood, in the third paragraph of that policy, we specifically say this does not apply to people circulating nominating petitions. It does not apply to election officials working on registration or election day. and it does not apply to an employee who would like to run for an elected office in the township. So understand that, yes, in the vast majority of the cases that I reviewed, the court struck down the policy. It is because, as I was explaining before, the government employer failed to narrowly tailor their policy and failed to make it unambiguous. Here, we have narrowly tailored it, we have made it unambiguous, and we are relying upon a case out of the jurisdiction, the federal jurisdiction in which we sit. And that is, I think, as safe an approach as you can take to this controversial topic.
Oh, great. So I do have a couple of questions for you. Let's test that ambiguity a minute, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Let's say I'm an employee of the township and I belong to a social club that has a political affiliation with the Sunshine Party. I serve on the board of the board's executive committee of that organization. The executive committee meets every election to endorse candidates in the Sunshine Party for upcoming elections and help them get elected, because it is our personal belief that the Sunshine Party candidates are in the best interest of our community. That is a personal opinion, which under the U.S. Constitution, I am entitled to. In looking at paragraph 2 that you wrote, would I be in violation of the personnel policy if I was to vote as a member of the board executive committee to endorse a candidate in the Sunshine Party?
That's a lot for me to take in at once, so I'm kind of thinking through it here. Are you referring to a publicly elected position?
I'm not referring to a publicly elected position. This is a social club that is the Sunshine Party Club, the Sycamore Township Sunshine Party Club.
So it's nothing that's publicly elected. It's nothing sanctioned by the revised code.
That's correct.
Okay, so in the Dayton case, the situation was that
I don't want to know about the Dayton case.
I think it answers your question, which is that the employee, Reynolds, was president of the Fraternal Order of Police, Lodge number 44, and he signed a letter endorsing a candidate for election to the Dayton City Commission. And even though he was doing that as the president of the FOP, the policy restricting political activity was still found to be constitutional as applied to him. So based on that and my limited time to evaluate the question, I would say if a public employee who's a president of the FOP can be subject to the manual, the policy, that a public employee who's in a private club could also be subject to it.
Okay.
Let me add to that, Tom, if I could address your example there too, because I'm not sure Deepak answered the question you asked. Let's say the Sunshine Party has private members. You're one of them. Let's say Tracy's one, and it's meeting on his back porch. There's a distinction between private activity in this policy and public activity. Certainly members of the club who happen to be township employees can privately vote for this social club you've talked about to make an endorsement. The distinction is if the employee were then to go out and be the face of that and the spokesperson and say make commercials or stand on the street corner publicly declaring that I have endorsed, then that is a sort of behavior I understand would not be allowed for the employee under this. But the decision to have private input in a private social club and make input and even vote within that is not infringed upon at all by this. Am I correct in that, Mr. Desai?
Correct.
I do not see that in paragraph 2. Can you point that out to me, Mr. James?
Well, it doesn't prohibit it in paragraph 2, so there's nothing to point out. But let me read paragraph 2 here, and let's put it up on the screen. That's good. To further promote an apolitical work environment, the employee shall not engage in any political campaigning pertaining to Sycamore Township other than to express privately their opinions. Political campaigning includes any overt public expression, including without limitation on interactive computer-mediated technologies, blah, 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 social media, in other words, or overt public activity for or against a public organization, candidate, or referendum issue, such as a formal public endorsement, distributing campaign material of any kind, or posting campaign material other than on one's own person or personal private property. There's nothing in there that prohibits a township employee from gathering as part of the Sunshine Party organization and participating in the organization's vote to determine its endorsed candidate. Nothing at all.
Is that how you read it, Deepak?
Yes. Again, I think that first sentence that talks about, expressing privately their opinions would sort of speak to that, but there's nothing prohibiting being part of a private group.
Okay. So let me ask you another question. Let's say that I'm an employee and I run for elected office as precinct executive for the Sunshine Party, and the voters in my precinct elect me. As part of my duty and responsibility as a precinct executive, I am responsible for endorsing Sunshine Party candidates with my fellow precinct executives, as well as actively promoting and campaigning for them. This is my statutory responsibility as an officially elected precinct executive. When I carry out my responsibilities that I'm obligated to as an elected official, am I violating paragraph 2 of the guidelines you wrote?
So let me make sure I understand this correctly. So now you're talking about a precinct executive who is publicly elected. Is that correct, Mr. Weedman?
That's correct.
Okay. So you have a statutorily authorized position that is publicly elected, and then you're telling me there's a statutory duty to endorse a candidate and to support that candidate both vocally, financially, or whatever.
Correct.
Am I understanding everything correctly?
Actively promoting and campaigning for them, that's correct.
Yeah. So in that particular case, I would say that this policy would not prohibit that. And that might be something that we want to make clear, provided all the assumptions I just gave my opinion on are accurate. So if there is in fact a revised code scheme that provides for publicly electing such an individual, and in fact, the revised code statutorily imposes upon them the duty to endorse and campaign, then I would say, again, sitting here, cold, that would be something that the policy would not prohibit. And I'd want to call something like that out specifically in paragraph 3, like we did with the nominating petitions and the election officials.
My understanding is precinct officials don't individually endorse, of course, anyway. They vote to give the party's endorsement or the local precinct's endorsement with their fellow precinct chairs. I didn't understand you, Mr. Weedman, for example, as a precinct executive, or Mr. Kellums as one, to have individual blessing authority to endorse within the precinct itself. Am I incorrect about that?
So the precinct executives, through the leadership of the ward chairs, meet, vote to endorse a candidate, and pass that endorsement on to the Hamilton County Party to ratify that.
Right. So if you were to disagree with the vote of the fellow ward chairman, you would not have the authority to individually endorse some other candidate yourself, would you?
That would be correct. That would be correct.
Yeah, I'll take a look at that, because that's a little bit different scenario then.
Well, wait, that doesn't necessarily, they vote, the precinct executive votes, that's endorsed. They're going to endorse Mr. Jones, Mr. James, whoever. Then that doesn't mean that they have to go out and support that guy and go door to door and all that.
That's exactly what it means, Mr. Lamar. That's what a precinct executive is elected to do.
He's elected to cast the vote for that person.
The elected precinct executive is elected to actively participate in the process to get candidates of that party elected in the election. That's what they're elected to do. Not just vote. That's one of many functions that a precinct executive does.
But Mr. Weedman, is that duty that you're saying the precinct executive has, is that by practice or is that statutorily prescribed?
I'll leave that to you, but I would suggest that either way, they're duly elected officials And in this case, they would not be prohibited from participating in the process, as you have suggested as you have outlined in paragraph 2.
Yeah, so I'll have to look into that specific question. I'm not familiar with that scenario.
And I guess this brings up another question. How do we reconcile with Joe Burke, who's also works for the township, and he's a big promoter of the Blue Moon Party and their candidates? Are we going to tell him that I can work for the Sunshine Party candidates, but he can't work for the Blue Moon Party candidates? Won't that potentially subject us to the argument of unfair treatment of Joe Burke, even though I have a duty as a precinct executive?
Yeah, I'll look into the precinct executive question. I'm not sure. Again, I would stick by my original answers. It's sort of like the nominating petition issue. If we're talking about elected officials who have statutorily prescribed duties under the revised code, then that gives me pause about whether the policy would apply to them. But if it's more a matter of practice or personal preference to go out and campaign and promote, that's a different scenario where you don't have statutory duty to do that.
Deepak, according to the new language in paragraph 2, an employee can talk to his next door neighbor in a private conversation about who he supports, and that is not specifically prohibited. Can he go to his friend on the next block and have that same private conversation? What about his cousin in another neighborhood? What constitutes a private conversation? Under that restriction, an employee could, quote, privately express their opinion to every resident in Sycamore Township so long as it was expressed privately.
Yeah, I think you have to read that in the context of the next sentence, which is part of the same paragraph, to give you an idea of what expressing your private opinion means. Let us tell you what it doesn't mean. You can't make an overt public expression. You can't engage in overt public activity by a formal endorsement, by distributing campaign material, by putting up campaign signs, other than on your own property, of course. So that's where the line is drawn. If somebody wants to express their opinion to their neighbor while they're out cutting the grass, they run into their cousin at the supermarket and they want to express their private opinion there, they can do that. It's the overt political activity that the policy prohibits.
So isn't that pretty ambiguous?
I'm sorry, say it again?
Isn't there plenty of ambiguity there?
I don't think so. And Judge Rice didn't think so.
I'm taking a walk and I just happen to walk down the block and I see 20 neighbors and I tell all of them, express my opinion to all of them. Am I violating the law? Am I violating the rules?
I don't think so. I mean, it's sort of, pardon me, I think that's a little bit, unlikely, but to the extent you want to use that example, what I would say again is that as long as you're expressing your opinion privately while you're out walking your dog, taking a jog, and you happen to come across 20 neighbors and, you just want to say, hey, I love candidate A and I don't like candidate B, you can do that because you're not distributing campaign material. You're not putting up campaign signs. Again, you're not engaging in any overt public activity or public expression.
On the other hand, if you're out canvassing in a neighborhood nowhere near your own, knocking on doors, handing out campaign material, that is something that, as an employee of the township, this would prevent. The underlying purpose of all this, of course, is in the first paragraphs of this and in some other thoughts in the cases Mr. Desai mentioned. We value our employees' First Amendment rights. Absolutely. They should be able to vote for any candidate they want and speak privately about that. But being public employees puts a special obligation on them here. We want to promote an apolitical work environment, meaning one without politics, and to protect employees from political pressures where, say, a trustee leans on a longtime employee and says, I need your support. I'm responsible for you having a job. You need to support me. That's not fair to the employee. It puts them in an awkward position. It also creates the impression to our residents that politics matter in terms of what the township is doing and what services it's providing. Other townships have explicit policies as to that. Delhi, for example, says in their handbook, employees of the township shall serve all township residents equally. The political opinions or affiliations of any resident shall in no way affect the amount or quality of service received from the township. We want our residents to have that same feeling about all of us, and not to have employees feeling that they're pressured to campaign for their bosses within the township, whether you support them or not. So that's the purpose of this, and we're trying to mold it in a way where it protects our employees in a narrowly tailored way that fulfills the compelling interest of avoiding politicization of the public employees. The Supreme Court has recognized government entities may impose restraints on the job-related speech of public employees that would be plainly unconstitutional if it were applied to the public at large. The Supreme Court has concluded that a narrow class of speech restrictions based on an interest in allowing governmental entities to perform their functions doesn't run afoul of the First Amendment. That's in the famous Citizens United cases of all places, in fact. And Sycamore has a compelling interest in ensuring its resolutions and programs are executed apolitically and without any political bias or favoritism. The township has a compelling interest in maintaining the loyalty, efficiency, and nonpartisanship of its public employees and preventing them from being involved in the politics that elect their boss to avoid any improper influences. So, Mr. Weidman, I'm sure you don't want the workplace politicized either. I'm sure you don't want our employees feeling pressure to have to go against their own personal feelings politically because they feel like they need to do it to respond to the overlords who are ultimately in charge. How do we accomplish that?
So,
And if I could just maybe...
let me address that in a minute, but I had one more question for Deepak. Deepak, let me ask this final question. In your professional opinion, and as an attorney and our law director, do you think it is wise and worth the risk of serious financial exposure to have a policy that restricts our employees from freely participating in the political process and robbing them of their constitutionally guaranteed First Amendment rights? What is your opinion on that?
Well, I can't answer that question the way you phrased it because I don't think this policy robs public employees of their constitutionally protected rights.
Exclude that from my question and then answer the question.
So the question I think it really gets down to is the township exposing itself to litigation by imposing such a policy? And the answer to that is clearly, yeah, that's a real possibility. Because if there's never been such a policy in place, it is very likely that somebody is not going to be happy about there being a new policy in place and will then challenge it. But you have to understand, as Mr. James was saying, the compelling interest, and Judge Rice laid out 4 of them: avoidance of a civil service built on patronage, governmental impartiality, promote the independence of civil servants, public interest in avoiding the buildup of strongly entrenched political machines. Those were 4 interests that Judge Rice in this Dayton versus Reynolds case found the policy to promote. And he went on to say, the city establishes the prohibitions in an effort to prevent city employees from being pressured into such participation because such pressures may adversely affect employee morale and efficiency. The city employee might reasonably fear retaliation for failing to support or contribute to a city commission candidate if there is no prohibition on their not participating in these activities. Incumbent city commissioners might gain an unfair political advantage if city employees were not prohibited from participating in city commission elections, and political favoritism or the appearance of political favoritism might result from the city employees participating in city elections. So what Judge Rice is saying is that these policies that are protecting these interests are real and they're legitimate because they protect the employees and they protect the township or governmental entity.
So what I think I heard you say, Mr. Deepak, was that you think that we run significant risk in litigation exposure by putting this policy in place, just like most other ones did. I mean, you talked about ambiguity. You talked about the fact that every judge is different, and every judge looks at this differently. And I might add that in our judicial system locally, which a lot of the district court judges come from, their law clerks work for them tirelessly and endlessly to get them elected and reelected. So the suggestion that a district judge hearing this case might not, from the Cincinnati district, might not suggest that, and I think this might go beyond the bounds of reasonableness, is very possible. And so I ask you that question because I want to let the residents know that if we make a decision to favorably on paragraph 2, that we knowingly run the risk of subjecting them to significant financial exposure. So thank you for your answers, Deepak. I do want to address Mr. James, if I could.
And I note quickly, by the way, that Mr. Porter got dropped out of the conference here. He just called me and he's trying to get back in. Mr. Ebel, if you're monitoring and he's waiting in the waiting room or something.
He has not logged in yet.
He has not. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Weedman.
So, Mr. James, in a previous meeting, you said, and I quote, "I agree, I don't want to restrict our employees' First Amendment rights, but I do want to protect them from undue influence," end of quote. And then you went on to say that the federal government has the Hatch Act, which prevents employees of government bodies from being, quote, coerced into politicking for their bosses, end quote. Let me say right here and right now publicly, there clearly is no evidence whatsoever that coercion of our employees has ever taken place in this township. Absolutely none. Now, there are plenty of false allegations, that I can assure you, but absolutely zero evidence. And Mr. James, let me say, I agree with you that coercion to participate is wrong and should never take place. But by restricting participation altogether, we unlawfully go beyond the bounds of eliminating coercion and right into the center of abridging the freedoms and constitutional rights of our employees. That is why I strongly oppose the language as written in second paragraph. In the first paragraph, it says that we, quote, do value the First Amendment rights of our employees, and in no way would we want to infringe on those rights intentionally or unintentionally. It is incumbent upon us as trustees to refrain from actively or overtly soliciting the assistance of an employee regarding political activities of any sort. I totally agree with all of that. That is all stated out in the first paragraph. The thing that is so unbelievable is we start the first paragraph stating that we value our employees' First Amendment rights, and in the second paragraph, we completely torpedo our employees' First Amendment rights. This language is highly probable to place our township and its residents in financial jeopardy by subjecting us to expensive litigation, both attempting to defend our position and more likely losing a court case, as Deepak has suggested, happens in the vast majority of these cases. I read that Mr. LaBarbera has brought this subject up no less than 6 times in public meetings in his first 2 years on the board. And no less than 6 times was told by our law director, Doug Miller, that he researched the situation and we cannot prohibit the First Amendment rights of our employees, period. By restricting our employees from participating in the political process and expressing their opinion, we are doing just that. Participating in the political process is the foundation of our republic. Where does this end? Do we next decide to prohibit the religious freedoms because we don't like the religion an employee chooses to practice? When our employees took a job with the township, many of them over 20 years ago, we never told them that they had to give up their constitutional First Amendment rights as a condition of employment. For us to suggest that we now want to change the rules and abridge the rights of our employees is absolutely offensive to me. We live in America, and this is completely un-American. People all over the world living under oppressive government rule would give anything to live with the freedoms we have in this country. And now you're suggesting that this board should take some of those rights away from our employees. To me, that is totally and completely unacceptable. In summary, let me just say that I fully support the language in the first paragraph as great policy for our township. I believe the language in this paragraph 2 that has been presented today is totally wrong, is highly offensive, and subjects our township residents to significant financial exposure. It would be a travesty for our employees and our residents to implement such a reckless policy, and I absolutely cannot support that language under any circumstances. And I'm done with my comments.
Okay, and I'll add something into this. Can you hear me? Am I okay? Because I went out for a second. And I brought this up before, Mr. Weidman, in all due respect, the 2017 election when I ran, the residents were concerned because they thought it was improper, because at every single polling location, we had a Sycamore Township worker. And I was told this was a practice that went on for 32 years. I brought this up a number of times. There is a conceptual problem. One of the employees, Tracy Kellums, sitting right here with us this morning, worked the Deer Park High School location with Tom Weidman and Cliff Bishop all day long, November the 7th. On December the 7th, he was given a raise of over $5,500 and a 3-year contract that is a perpetual contract that will never end, guaranteed contract, given 3 weeks before I was sworn in. In researching this is unprecedented, the contract he has for his position. Everyone who worked the polls that year got a significant raise. This past year, the cost of living was 1.6%. We had guys making 5%, 5.8%, one worker that worked down the street here in the Sturbridge location. We've heard your "This is America, Mr. LaBarbera" speech over and over again.
LaBarbera, you have no idea what
Let me finish. We were respectful to you, Tom. Please let me speak, okay? If you can hold your breath for a minute. We heard this, your First Amendment, got to support the candidate of your choice. However, with the exception of 2, maybe 3 of those employees, they don't even live in Sycamore Township. No township, village, city, Anderson, Green, Sam's, Loveland, Madeira, Deerfield, Blue, we went all around. Nobody. And they were appalled that we had this in our township that went on for years and years. We encouraged this activity. According to some former employees, they were coerced into working and taking the day off. There's a lot of pressure, whether you think it or not, Tom. If the guy next to you is going to go work for Tracy and go, "I'll work the polls," and the next guy is going to sit there and say, "What?" Because in that month period between election day and when we give the raises out, you want to be on your best behavior. So if your boss is Tracy Kellums, everyone knows where he stands politically, and he's the one who's going to be giving out the raises in a month. Well, I better show him I'm a team player. There's been intimidation, retaliation. It's gone on no more in Sycamore Township. You have used the township employees for personal benefit. We don't have our employees. We don't have these people put in this position again. That's the end of it, as far as I'm concerned.
So, Mr. LaBarbera, let me just say, you have no idea what went on in that executive session when contracts and raises were discussed, because you weren't there. And in fact, you weren't even a trustee yet.
So well, I saw the raises. Wait. Mr. Porter has them.
I stopped and didn't interrupt you. Don't mislead the public in saying that you know what that was discussed, because you clearly don't. You weren't there. I will say that after the election, I had 7 different employees all come to me and express their concerns about your vindictiveness, and that they were concerned that you would take revenge out on them solely because they exercise your
gentlemen. We are way off business here. We're not sticking with the agenda. We are off the agenda. Let's get back onto it.
Deepak, I am not done. I'm going to finish this. I will.
Mr. Weidman, you're engaging in a personal attack here that Has
am not
nothing to do with the policy in front of us.
Just speaking the facts, Deepak, let's be clear.
Mr. Weedman, I would implore you, I think everyone understands where the conflict lies and what is before us today. We've got to keep an orderly meeting here. Is the political activity policy.
I'm going to tell you this. When we have a trustee who goes into a public meeting and drags one of his employees through the mud, someone's got to defend him. In this case, I'm going to be defending him. The contracts that were developed in the end was the only reason for the raises in contracts, it was because the employees earned those contracts and those raises. They earned them through merit and hard work and service to our residents. There was no other reason, and when you allege any other reason, you are clearly lying to our residents for political purposes.
Very coincidental.
That now, Mr. LaBarbera.
I call for a vote now.
May I have a comment?
We haven't had a motion yet.
Yeah, there's no motion. but I have a further comment here as well. I want to find a way to make this work, to make our environment for our township employees apolitical. Mr. Weedman shares in that view, it sounds like. Mr. LaBarbera shares in that view. There are constitutional ways to make that happen. Mr. Desai is as confident as he can be that this is there. Mr. Weedman has raised some questions, on the other hand. But there's certainly a public perception out there that there is politics that goes on in the township. Good Lord, yes. But it does happen. And there's favoritism among employees. That perception is created in various ways, but there's probably no better example than something I saw the other day. You know, when you make public records requests or go looking through public records, you can find all kinds of things. So I'm going to see if I can share my screen here quickly. Here's a good example. I pasted this into Word. Let's see here. So can you see this?
It's kind of small, but you can see it. Can you make it bigger?
Well, I'll just point out. I'll zoom in. A former township employee, while still a township employee but leaving, sent instructions on challenges for the future in the township with some policy information, financial information, and others. It went to a few people in the township, Mr. Kellums and one of the trustees, Mr. Weedman, and some others, but not to Mr. LaBarbera, who was also a trustee, or to me, who had already been elected. Why is that? The position of administrator is supposed to be a nonpartisan when reporting equally to all of the trustees. That just feeds the perception that there's politics going on in various ways and that some trustees are cut out of other things by employees for whatever reason. We don't need that. We have a great staff. We have great employees. We don't want them to feel the pressure of having to politic if they don't want to do it, especially if they don't live in the township and don't really have any reason to care about what's going on in township politics. Others do live in the township. They've lived here a long time and have very vested interest in that. Mr. Kellums is a great longtime employee of the township who lives in the township and is a local precinct executive for something other than the Sunshine Party. But, you know, he's got a vested interest in all that too. So how can we make this work so there's an apolitical environment where other employees who don't really have any vested interest in this anyway, they don't live here, don't get drug into this? That's the challenge that faces us. This is my suggestion. There is no motion pending right now. We do have a proposed policy we've been discussing at great length here for a while. Mr. Weedman has raised some questions that I think it's important for Mr. Desai to look into a little bit further. I'll ask you another question too. Can we exclude township residents who are employees from the policy constitutionally so that those who do have a vested interest in voting for the people have the ability to do it if that's something the law might require here, which would seem to eliminate any concerns about us getting sued. I can't imagine some outsider who lives in Mason is going to get all worked up about not being able to go campaign in Sycamore Township for me or Mr. Weedman or Mr. LaBarbera or Mr. Porter or some other guy named Doug who wants to run or whatever. Is that a legitimate thing we can do? And frankly, in looking at the language here, are we making sure that people who are already in office are able to campaign for themselves under this? Technically, we are employees of the township as well. And I hadn't looked at it with a close eye as to that before, but I think that's something to look into. I would suggest Mr. Desai research Mr. Weedman's concerns. I would urge Mr. Weedman to make your suggestions as to how can we accomplish these goals to make this an apolitical workplace so that you don't have to worry about me pressuring some employee to go campaign against you. How can we do this? How can we accomplish it? It sounds like you've gotten some legal advice on this yourself already. I know you're not an attorney and you've been very adept at reading these cases here. So let's figure out how we can make this work so that we insulate all of our great employees and staffers from these political pressures that they might otherwise feel, and communicate clearly to the public that we don't have a politicized township. We have a professional township with a great professional staff that does things for any residents, regardless of who they are, whether they're for the Sunshine Party or the Blue Rock Party or whatever it was or whatever else. Mr. Desai, could you move ahead with that?
I will, sir.
And I would
My comment. I'm sorry, the dog is commenting, so I'm going to mute myself.
I would just suggest that we can accomplish that very easily by adopting the first paragraph of this policy and letting that be the driving force. If we're not soliciting as trustees, as a fiscal officer, if we are not soliciting employees in the workplace, that's a great start. And I think that that doesn't preclude them then from exercising their own opinions and whether or not they want to work for somebody or not. I mean, I think that the paragraph number 1 helps to accomplish what we're trying to do.
Mr. James and Mr. Desai put a lot of effort into this. They did a lot of research on this, and I'd like to see this go forward to what it is.
Could I maybe suggest a compromise based on Mr. James' comments that perhaps it would be appropriate to move to adopt the first paragraph of the policy, which seems to embody a principle that everybody agrees on, and then allow me until the next meeting to research the issues that Mr. Weidman and Mr. James have brought up regarding paragraphs 2 and 3?
I'm okay with that. I will move that we adopt the first paragraph of the political activities proposed clause here while taking under advisement the remaining portions for potential feedback.
All right, so we have a motion and a second for Mr. Weidman.
Any discussion? Hearing none. Mr. LaBarbera?
What we want to do is we want to rewrite that middle paragraph. Am I right, Mr. James, Mr. Desai?
All we're voting on today is the first paragraph.
And you're going to add the middle paragraph when you get it before us at the next meeting.
Right. By the next meeting, I will research the issues that Mr. James and Mr. Weidman have brought forth.
After researching them all these weeks. Okay. Okay. Go ahead, Rob.
Mr. LaBarbera?
Aye.
Mr. James?
Aye.
Mr. Weidman?
Aye.
Mr. Warwick, anything else, Mr. Warwick? Is there any update I want to ask on that Kugler Mill, Tri-Health, Davis, Kubicki project? Could you?
I don't have any update.
No?
The other thing on my agenda was a finance reporting item that I'd like to suggest we table. Mr. Porter and I are working on some numbers, and we just weren't able to spend enough time on it. So we'll come back to the board on those things later.
Okay, and Mr. Porter, will you be working with Mr. Warwick on that?
Yes, Mr. Warwick and I have been in conversation. The next thing coming up probably for timetable is the tax budget. It's a required form that that the trustees will vote on in the second meeting in July. That will include the expenses for the past 2 years, plus actual expenses for the first 6 months and projected income and expenses for the second 6 months. I thank administration and my office. We seem to be working together well, and we'll have that information for you. well ahead of that second meeting. We have to wait for the actual figures to come in through June, but hopefully in the early part of July, we'll have those figures available for the trustees, and we'll have a better handle on where our revenue and expenses are shaking out due to this COVID public health emergency. As we've talked here today, some expenses are going down, but some revenues may be going down also because of people not working, et cetera. So we'll have a better handle on it once we have the figures for the first 6 months, and we'll know whether we have to slow down on spending or whether we can maintain the budget that we have for the year. Thank you.
Can we clear up one financial thing on the record from the last meeting? Because I know there was some confusion about a bond in the last meeting and the interest rate on it. Mr. Porter, I don't know if you wanted to comment on what the rate on that bond we were discussing is.
Yeah, Mr. Warwick last time was, he was just looking at the maximum that could be charged. He sent out a correction the next day, which I appreciated. The interest rate was more along the lines of 2.1%. And I think you all got that. And that's more in line with what the market rate is for, treasury bonds and the investments that the township can be involved in. So that's been cleared up. In fact, I anticipate the interest rates will be dropping even further in what we can receive from our investments and what we borrow money for. So the fact that you gentlemen enacted the callable provision on that bond is probably a good idea, because we might be able to get it at a substantially lesser interest rate even than the 2.1 we're paying now.
Great, thanks. I just wanted to make sure we cleared that up on the record since we discussed it last time. So thanks.
Mr. Warwick, any public comments to share from residents?
I did not receive any.
Any other comments for Mr. Warwick? Mr. James, Mr. Weedman?
Nope.
Skylar Miller, Sycamore Township Head of Zoning and Planning with this report. Skylar?
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. Just very briefly, we are going to hold a Zoom meeting for an upcoming BZA. We have one variance that needs to be reviewed within certain legal time requirements, and then we do have some resolutions that are going to be adopted as well, but those cases have already been approved. So other than that, Trustee James, did you want to lead the discussion about conditions, or did you want me to try and summarize?
Well, I'll ask about it since I brought this up. And let me back up just a second. Also, Mr. LaBarbera had asked Mr. Warwick, I think, about the Tri-Health project. Was that right? Some of you may observe the demolition of the old Hauser building has ended now, and they've actually replaced the berm on the permanent landscaping buffer of the townships there. So they're no longer coming through there. So that was good to see that they got that done. The rest of that is still a bit up in the air right now, I think. I'd ask that we add a discussion item here, though, about ensuring compliance with zoning conditions for development projects that the township has put in place in the past, just to ensure we are following through on those things. And what instigated this, there were a few things. Some residents over behind the CIG project going up next to Jewish Hospital have been concerned about the excessive noise coming from the construction work there. It's made worse for them because so many people are at home due to the stay-at-home order now, and so they're hearing this noise all day long that they'd otherwise, some of them at least, be off at work and not hearing. The township put some express conditions in place as to that project, which were actually strict enough that it surprised me in one sense, because we have an old noise ordinance in the township dating back to 1994, I think it is. But when we took on our own zoning and adopted our zoning code in later years, we put much harsher restrictions in place, to the point that in the zoning code, at least, there is a 62 decibel limit for sound. The resolution approving the CIG project in the end, after all the hearings and controversy, had many, many conditions in it, one of which was, I don't have it in front of me, but I think it was number 26. It actually expressly incorporated the section of our zoning code that has that 62 decibel limit within it. So residents have been asking about this, and I'll let Skylar or Ms. Miller report on what's been happening there, but the township has been keeping an eye on that. The other thing that got my attention is I've seen frequently in our approval resolutions, we put other conditions in there, like no cell towers on site, things like that. But we have one which is regularly put in about there being 0-foot candle light spill at the property's edge, whatever that means. It sounds very important and very limiting, and yet I can still see light coming out from those properties after they're built, and I assume it doesn't mean they need to be a black hole sucking all light inside, but it's a condition we put on, and so I'm wondering, do we go back and measure for that sort of thing afterward to ensure compliance? Before you address that too, the third thing that's come up, the Myers-Cooper project at the corner of Galbraith and Kenwood Roads, the remaining phase of that is nearly complete. The township put in some very specific landscaping requirements there. Mr. Weedman at the time, I think, called it the most extensive landscaping requirements for opacity or opaqueness or something of the sort we've ever put in place. But residents are concerned because if you look back there now, there are essentially a few Charlie Brown Christmas trees there that you can see right through to the building. I know Mr. Miller has been looking into that as well, and there are some residents who are very concerned. So the point of all this was to ensure, first of all, that we are going back and making sure we follow up on these conditions we put in place, generally speaking, and that we have provisions in place to do that, and that if we don't, we put them in place. And then secondly, these specific things that residents have asked about, I wanted to get a report on those. So I'll shut up. Thank you.
You're good. Okay, so I am following up on these cases after they've been approved, working with the developers as they move forward. When an activity on site is in conflict with the conditions set by Board of Trustees, there's a couple different ways that we can address that. I'm jumping around a little bit, but in the case of the Sycamore Executive Center 2, that condition specifically stated that a final approval will not be issued until those conditions are met. So I am actively working with the developer there. He understands that we need to address the landscaping issue that he has on site. He's willing to work with us, within reason. Deepak, that may be a conversation that you and I have later on to try and help him resolve that and see what makes the most sense. But in that case, it's not really a violation. It's so much he hasn't met the requirements to receive a final. In the instance of CIG, we've went round and around with this. We are monitoring the site. We do have sound meters that actually register a decibel reading for that we can use. A lot of our codes have to deal with mechanical sound. So when you look at a site that is finished or at least partially finished, there's outside equipment. There's compressors for air conditioning units, refrigerators, other support equipment, incidental to the use of the site, generators, things of that nature. A lot of our code is actually referencing those permanent mechanical fixtures. And I did work with Mr. Desai on this. I think the condition of the resolution approving the CIG development is mostly referencing that mechanical equipment. With that being said, there's an opportunity here to do some, shall we say, good neighbor, resolution. I'm hoping to work with Mr. Warwick and establish, good dialogue with the developers. Maybe there are some measures that can be put in place. Unfortunately, construction sites are loud. There's not really additional sound deadening devices that you put on heavy machinery. And actually, because the 1994 resolution is still in effect, it does actually make some allowances for construction activities that are permitted by the township, as well as setting time limits on that construction activity. So we're pulling language from multiple reference points, but on the whole, construction activity is prohibited and permissible. So, but like I said, we will continue to work with that developer and hopefully find some relief for the residents in that area. As far yes,
a question about that. So I do remember us having the conversation about going out and taking some decibel readings to get an idea what the ambient decibel level was prior to construction. And I thought that was done, but I mean, I wasn't there, so I can't say for sure. But I think that gives us a more reasonable expectation as to what we can expect off that property, number one. It'd be difficult for us to do that today because obviously we know there's limited traffic on the road, so it really wouldn't give us a true reading. But if you can find those ambient decibel readings, that would be helpful, number one. And number two, I would agree with you that the condition, I believe it may have been number 26 in the resolution, but I'm not positive. That pertained to mechanicals on the property. So it would be air conditioning units. If they had a generator, it would include that generator. I know we had the issue with Jewish Hospital where at one point in time when they put their new bigger generator in, we had a lot of issues. And because it was, the noise was extensive. And so we made them buffer that generator to ensure that the people on Frolic across the street were not listening to that noise. So I believe that when we passed the resolution and condition 26 was in place, that had to do with mechanicals at the completion of the project. As you know, it's impossible to monitor or to regulate construction equipment because let's face it, construction equipment is loud. There's nothing to do about it. Now we can, and we do, and we definitely should enforce the hours of which they're operating in. If they're violating those hours with the noise resolution, we should be going after them for that.
Absolutely. And again, we are continuing to monitor the site. Kevin, our zoning inspector, is actually periodically throughout the week, he's going out and measuring at different locations, adjacent to the subject property. He also does put in some Saturday hours, so he's checking on the weekends as well, see if there's any inconsistencies in activity. You told me about the baseline readings. I have not found those yet. We have several terabytes of data. I've done some basic searches for it. It's not associated with the case file at this point. So if we do have them, I will move them over. Kevin did. Although it's probably not the best baseline to establish, but we actually did take some measurements of other areas along Kenwood Road, including the intersection at Kenwood and Montgomery. There are certainly spikes of sound on site. I know, Mr. James, you've gotten anywhere between 60 to 90 decibels on site, I think is what you had. Is that correct?
Yeah, I measured an average of 74 mid-afternoon on a Saturday, I think, when there was work going on, and at peaks of 94 or so at times. Construction equipment moving there in the middle of the day also. And a resident back there has been measuring as well and has been finding similar ranges of sound.
Yeah, Kevin was getting mostly, I think it was 69 and then the low 70s, which is actually consistent with the intersection at Kenwood and Montgomery Road. That's not to say that those spikes aren't real and an annoyance. We did also measure the construction sounds behind our office. They're on Kenwood Road, and those are easily in the 80s and 90s. Fortunately, that site is a little further away from those residential properties behind us. But it's certainly a slightly louder construction site than what we have at CIG. So we're trying to establish some kind of baseline. Hopefully, we'll be able to find those readings from the beginning of the project.
Skylar, one of the reasons we wanted to look at that baseline was because there were some concerns that 62 decibels, if we had an ambient baseline decibel reading of 65, we'd be hard pressed to meet that 62 in our zoning resolution. So that was one of the reasons why we wanted to go back and look at that. And you might be able to help me. So so Kevin has been doing some readings, and he was out at Montgomery and Kenwood Road. And he did
Montgomery Kenwood Road was 77.
So it was 77. So that in and of itself exceeded the decibel allowance reading, the maximum decibel readings that we allow in the township. And that was, I assume, since the quarantine has been in place for everybody staying at home, and there wasn't as much traffic. Is that correct?
That's true. That was just those were taken on April 7th.
Okay.
So just last week.
Which would lead me to the question about the realistic nature of 62 decibels in our zoning resolution. And I just want, maybe you ought to take a look at that and just kind of get some feedback on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, again, if we're going back to, if you're trying to read all ambient noise, cars make certain sounds. I mean, a lawnmower is going to spike you up into the high 70s or even 80s. If we look at our code and we realize that it's, we're trying to zero in on those permanent mechanical sounds that are incidental to larger commercial projects. Like, again, those compressors, those generators. There are acoustic screenings for those. There are mufflers, things of that nature that can bring them down, so they're not adding to the ambient noise of the area. If we look at it in that context, 62 may be desirable, maybe not. So it's certainly worth looking at. If we're looking at general sounds from a property, if we're looking to, what's the trigger point for, a civil citation or some kind of, nuisance violation, 62 may not be the appropriate threshold.
Okay. Let me ask a few questions also here. That paragraph 26 in the approval resolution, I do note it reads in its entirety, all mechanical equipment must be screened both visually and acoustically. The determination for compliance will be made from 100 feet outside the property line. That's how it begins, but then it goes on. Township staff will monitor sound levels both before, during, and after construction using a sound pressure level meter to determine decibel levels. Meaning we did anticipate monitoring during construction of some sort as well. I don't know if this was drafted as well as it should have been, if it were intended to only build baselines to measure against mechanical equipment later. But 62 decibels, yes, and maybe that is, I don't know where that number came from originally when it went in our zoning code. If it's something we need to look at, we may need to do that. We were in the process a couple of years ago of going through revising the zoning code anyway, and then it turned out we were working from a flawed red line document, and the comparison the zoning commission was doing was off anyway. We need to get back to that project at some point too. Mm-hmm. So that's a consideration. But question for Mr. Desai, and are you still there, Mr. Desai? I see your video went out, but hopefully you are. The resolution adopting our zoning code and taking on zoning for the township, I think, was resolution 1998-1. There's an index of prior resolutions on our website, but not that resolution itself. I'd be curious to know the wording of that and whether Mr. Desai or Mr. Warwick perhaps or Mr. Miller could look at that. Did it explicitly override or revoke the prior noise ordinance that we had from '94, or is it made to work in conjunction with it? It may have addressed it. I just don't know. If it didn't address it, presumably
sure.
the old.
I don't want to speak for Mr. Desai. I can say that we've had some conversations about that. I think our zoning resolution and the updates to it have been more specific than the prior code. The 94 resolution is certainly broader than what we've addressed in zoning resolutions. So at least from those conversations, it's my understanding that the 1994 resolution is still in effect.
Okay, if you could take a look at the resolution adopting, or there's Mr. Desai, if you could do that, I just want to know, did we do anything that overrode the prior one, or was it designed to work in concert together, or did it supersede it in some way? That would be useful to know going forward, because we're still featuring that old noise ordinance on our website if someone searches for noise ordinance, and it's somewhat non-specific, except that it does say, on the other hand, if you've got a permit to do something, you can do it. Meaning if you have a construction permit, you can apparently make whatever noise you need to as long as you stay within the parameters of whatever the permit requires. So I think some clarity on that could be useful.
Okay, anything else, Skylar?
I do have a resolution for you.
Mr. Miller, before you go there, what Mr. James just mentioned about the noise ordinance is something I just wanted to mention to the trustees. Not looking for an answer today, and it's something that perhaps Mr. Ward could even provide some input on. I'm wondering why in the township we don't have a code of ordinances for things like the 94 noise ordinance. There are other ordinances out there for the township, and it might behoove us, rather than going and searching the township website, to have an actual code of ordinances that's indexed and has table of contents, so that you can actually put your finger on the various laws that we have pursuant to our home rule power in effect in the township.
I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, I do too.
Excellent, excellent.
Would it be all right if I work with Mr. Work on that?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea.
Yeah, please do.
Okay.
Yes,
thank
sounds
you.
good. Good idea.
Do we need a motion as to that right now, or do you want to develop what it'll be and then we move to approve it?
Yeah, we'll just do some background work and then come back with something. Okay.
Okay.
Thank
Okay,
you.
Scott, thank you, Deepak. Skylar, you have a resolution?
Yes, sir. So very briefly, this is a resolution providing for and authorizing removal of vegetation, garbage, refuse, and other debris, and declaring a nuisance for the property located at 8109 Reading Road, Sycamore Township. This is unfortunately, this is a commercial property that's not currently active. It's used for essentially dumping in that area. The property owner does have a responsibility to secure the site, and that's the property's been neglected. So I don't necessarily want to blame the property owner for every piece of junk and debris on the site, but they do have a duty to maintain that. So we have tried to work with them. We're not currently receiving a lot of feedback. So this is just kind of the next step so that the township can make arrangements to have the property cleaned up.
Motion to approve.
Second.
Porter?
Mr. LaBarbera,
Aye.
Mr. James,
Aye.
Mr. Weedman.
Aye.
I have one other question for Mr. Miller before we move on from him, if he was done with his part.
Yes, sir.
Okay. I had at least one resident ask me about this the other day. Summer is coming. We don't know what the state of the stay-at-home orders will be and how that's going to affect people. We don't know how that's going to affect area pools, among other things, and swim clubs, and whether they'll be able to open. I had at least one resident ask me about putting a temporary pool in her backyard. And she wasn't even meaning one of the semi-permanent surface type pools, the raised ones that people might put in and stay from year to year, but rather just a large inflatable even. And I looked briefly as to what we require, and at least if it's an above ground pool, we require zoning approval. If it's an inflatable pool, I assume we don't, but can you address that and what people need to do and what costs they might face if they want to temporarily put their own pool in this summer, but get rid of it later because it's not a permanent structure?
Sure. Above ground pools do require a zoning permit. I don't think the zoning code, zoning resolution specifies the type of construction, whether it's inflatable versus, rigid metal construction. I would recommend that those residents do apply for a permit. The one thing that I'm going to be looking for, no matter how it's constructed, is that it's properly enclosed. This is a safety property liability issue. We do require a 4-foot fence around all pools, so that the property owner maintains control and access to the pool. If you're doing a 3-foot inflatable pool, there's no 4-foot boundary between a small child that might be going down the sidewalk and that that potential hazard. So I would encourage residents. It's a free permit. They can do. Because we're not requiring those smaller residential applications. They don't have to go to county. We're accepting those online right now, and we can do the approvals electronically as well. They should submit a application, site plan, and show that it's being properly secured.
Okay, but that was my next question. There's no cost for them doing
No
it.
cost.
Could you put together something maybe to share out on social media about that? Because I have a feeling that's going to be a more common question as it gets warmer.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. We've been talking about that. You bring up a great question with the pools, but fences, small sheds. We're getting requests for driveway improvements with small retaining walls. All these permits that don't require Hamilton County review. We're trying to streamline our process and make those easier to obtain by residents. So we do need to update our website and formalize those procedures. Right now we're trying to work through those practices and see what makes the most sense. And we're working with residents on a case-by-case basis. So we'll firm those up in the near future, and we will put that out there for social media.
Thanks.
Anything else, Mr. James?
No, that's all. Thank you.
Okay, let's move on to Fiscal Officer. Mr. Porter, do you have any items to share?
Oh, I've already made my comments. Thank you.
And then with trustees' comments, Mr. Whedon.
I don't have any at this time.
Mr. James.
I don't have any others either at this time. Thanks.
And I'll just add that for the latest on the COVID-19, go to the front page of our website. You'll find a number of valuable links. This is evolving every day. And again, I know you received the 2020 spring newsletter. Please remember that this went to print prior to Governor DeWine's COVID-19 orders to limit public interaction to slow the spread of the virus. So use common sense, stay safe, stay healthy. God bless you. Announcement changes. You can check our website. Of course, all of the Trash Bash. Tracy will get back to you later and reschedule a number of these events. But right now, everything's canceled for this month. Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Mr. Porter?
Mr. LaBarbera,
Aye.
Mr. James,
Aye.
Mr. Weedman.
Everybody
Time
have,
is
everybody have a great day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
See you.
11:01, the time of dismissal.